Okay, so we're just waiting for the nod from our technical director, Natalie. Okay, Natalie says go for it. Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Designing for Landscape Resilience on the Google Campus webinar presented as part of the More Trees, Please webinar series. I am your host, Igor Lechin of the University of California Cooperative Extension. I am a Cooperative Extension advisor. I cover the Bay Area south of the Golden Gate, and I work with people who manage trees. And Canopy is an urban forestry organization, a nonprofit that plants and cares for trees throughout the Mid-Peninsula and is hosting this webinar series, again, the More Trees, Please series, to offer guidance from local experts on the ways to ensure resilient urban forests by providing useful tools and information. Now, before we start the webinar, we will plug in a job opportunity at Canopy. Canopy is looking for candidates for the tree program senior manager position, and this is a position that's responsible for overseeing all of Canopy's tree programs, and that would include planting, tree care, surveying, education, and advocacy. And you can find more information about this at the Canopy website. So again, this is a big opportunity for folks interested in urban trees. Now, just a bit about the logistics of the webinar. If you have questions for the speakers, those go into the question and answer box, and you can see the question and answer in your toolbar there. And Canopy's Elise Willis will be our question moderator today. And we'll have some time to answer questions after the presentation. But if you have the questions, just put them into the Q&A. Now, for technical support, for technical issues, send a message in the chat box to Natalie Brubaker, and she will be helping you out. Natalie is Canopy's Director of Education. If we don't get to all the questions today, we will add those to the Canopy website following the webinar, and they'll be answered. And just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded to the Canopy's website along with relevant resources. Finally, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. Please do fill out the survey, and thank you very much in advance. And those of you who are ISA certified arborists, you will receive the CEU code upon completion of the survey. So you have to complete the survey to receive the CEU code for the ISA folks. So that's it for me. Let me introduce our speakers very briefly, and we have three folks. Erin Beller is the Urban Ecology Program Manager for Google's Real Estate Sustainability team, and Erin leads efforts to improve ecosystem health for people and nature on the Google campus. So that's Erin. Then we have Dan Stevens. Dan is a restoration ecologist at H.D. Harvey & Associates. Dan has more than 35 years of experience overseeing habitat restoration project design and implementation in a wide variety of environments. That's Dan. And then finally, Drew. Drew Wenzel is a real estate development executive at Google, where he supports Google's ground-up development projects in the Bay Area. So that's Drew. Okay, and without any further ado from me, I will turn it over to Erin. Erin, the floor is yours.
Woo! Thanks, Igor. Thanks for the great introduction. And good morning and welcome, everybody. Super excited to be here. So as Igor mentioned, my name is Erin Beller, and I am the Global Urban Ecology Program Manager for Google. And I'm here with my colleagues, Dan and Drew. So we'll be tag teaming over the next hour to share a little bit with you about how we're using urban ecological science to design these biodiverse urban landscapes on Google's campus in Silicon Valley, and how that's informing some of our efforts in other places. So a little bit about where we're headed today. Next slide. So a little bit about where we're headed today. First, I'm going to give an overview of the program as a whole. Then I'll turn it over to Dan to do a deeper dive into some of the key public resources that we've developed that we think are particularly relevant for this group, and talk a little bit about some case studies on campus. And then Drew will wrap up with some current applications of the habitat design guidelines and these science resources at Google. Next. All right, so diving into the program, just a little bit of background on why Google has an ecology program. So the program was founded in 2014, and as Igor mentioned, it sits within the Real Estate and Workplace Services Sustainability team. This is part of our team's overall commitment to cultivate healthy spaces and places that enhance the well-being of both human and natural communities in the places where we operate. So it really is this intersection of both benefits for people and benefits for nature. Next slide. And so when we're talking about what we mean by healthy spaces and places at Google, we're thinking about the kind of whole suite of benefits that I'm sure folks on this call are very familiar with, from the kind of anchor dimensions of providing habitat and resources for wildlife and improving urban and regional biodiversity, but also thinking about some of the co-benefits around improving physical health and well-being and improving resilience and community infrastructure. So we're really seeing urban nature not just as kind of a nice amenity to have, but as part of the kind of essential infrastructure of our cities, as important as something like roads or clean water to developing livable and vibrant urban areas. Next slide. So Google's approach to urban ecology is rooted in these 4 overarching principles. First, our work is inspired by local context, so grounded in an understanding of historical ecology, and it's very place-based, while also being future-looking, taking into account climate envelopes, climate risk, for example. Second, our work is grounded in ecosystem science, so really thinking about how we can draw on the global urban ecology science to inform our work. Third, we're really thinking at scale and in context as we're thinking about planning for habitats and ecosystems. So not just working at the kind of plant scale, but really thinking about how we can create coherent ecosystems at scale within the urban matrix. And then finally, as you saw in the previous slide, we're thinking about designing for the kind of multiple suite of benefits that nature and cities can provide. Next slide. So our program touches on these 3 primary bends. The first is supporting science for urban ecology, and that's both for our own work on campus, but then also for the broader urban ecology efforts that are occurring in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. Second is creating campus landscapes that draw on this science. That I will touch on that a little bit, and then Dan and Drew will dive into that bucket far more. And then third is long-term management and monitoring. So my talk will touch on each of these briefly, and then Dan and Drew will dive into that second bucket for quite a bit. So turning first to this supporting science dimension. So urban ecology is still a relatively new field as a scientific discipline, and a big component of our work has been really supporting the science research that is needed to underpin our on-campus efforts. This is a kind of nice fit for Google. We're like a company of data geeks, so getting to really dive into the quantitative research on urban ecology has been a really great way to underpin our work. And so doing this, we are working really closely with our science and NGO partners. That includes Dan at HC Harvey, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, the Nature Conservancy, and a bunch of others, to really develop the science guidance that we see as necessary to implement that multi-benefit, place-based urban ecology strategy that I mentioned a few slides ago, and then to share the work that we're using as widely as possible. And the science research that we are developing spans across scales, from the regional or landscape scale to the city scale to the habitat or ecosystem scale, right down to the species scale in some cases. So over the next few slides, I'm going to just review some examples of some of the science we're using to inform our efforts. And this is going to be like a breakneck teaser. There's a lot more, we could probably give an hour talk in any one of these, but just a little bit to illustrate some of the resources that are available that we are drawing on ourselves. So I'm going to start at the city scale, which is really, I would say, the kind of anchor scale of our work. So a foundational framework for us has been this Making Nature City framework that was led by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. And this report synthesizes the global research on urban biodiversity support into this kind of systematic science-based approach for how we can support nature in cities. So the framework outlines 7 elements that work together to maximize urban biodiversity. So things like open space or green space patch size or connectivity, the quality of urban matrix. And so we're using this framework to guide a spatially based landscape scale approach to design for urban biodiversity on campus. And this provides an opportunity for us to really think about our campus within the larger landscape context and really ask these questions around, well, like how much green space is needed and where and in what configuration and what kind of structure in order to really support urban biodiversity as supported by the science literature. Next slide. And so one of the ways that we are using this framework is to develop this visual vocabulary of what these elements actually look like on the ground to provide a tool for our design teams to implement biodiversity friendly design. So folks who may not be super familiar with ecology, but a nice way to think about what we mean. So as we think about connections, for example, so these features like corridors along green streets or riparian corridors, we have provided this kind of lookbook of examples from campus. Next slide. That illustrate what we're talking about. So for example, here, this is an image illustrating the integration of new planting areas adjacent to ecological features that are already existing in the landscape. Next slide. And then we contrast that for each dimension with what the dimension is not. So for example, creating this fragmented habitat in small isolated patches. So creating a kind of intuitive way to understand these potentially dense scientific principles. So then zooming down to the habitat scale, we've also developed these science-based habitat design guidelines. And this has been led by H.G. Harvey and Associates and with lots of great input from Canopy and others in the environmental NGO community. And so these design guidelines really support the actual nitty-gritty of designing for habitats, implementing habitats for our Bay Area campuses. So thinking about plant selection recommendations and configuration, all the design and management considerations that go into actually creating urban ecosystems. And so this is something that we developed a few years ago and are using in all of our projects. And since then, we've also partnered with local NGOs to make these guidelines available as a public resource for cities and agencies and NGOs, and then also a spinoff that's tailored for residential backyards in Silicon Valley. So Dan will be talking about this specific resource in a lot more detail very shortly. So then at the species scale, native oaks, as many of you probably know, are a big component of our campus planting palette, valley oaks and live oaks in particular. So we've been working with our science partners to develop these re-oaking Silicon Valley guidelines and then incorporate them into our campus design. And so these are guidelines that give really specific and quantitative details about how we can maximize oak function and oak connectivity within the urban landscape. So providing guidelines for things like tree spacing or specific understory planting palettes or tree canopy planting palettes. And so Drew will be talking more about how this has been expressed on our campus. And then finally, zooming back out to the landscape scale. Next slide. So we just published a manuscript led by our partners at the San Francisco Estuary Institute that's focusing on this question of how cities can contribute to regional biodiversity, so across the entire landscape. And we're really seeing this as a big gap in the urban ecology literature. And so this is a paper that catalogs how wildlife interact with urban areas, how they use cities, and then identifies these kind of core pathways for these positive contribution of cities to regional biodiversity. So things like providing stopover habitat for migratory species or increasing habitat heterogeneity with the often really unique conditions that are present in urban areas. Next slide. Okay, so that was, hopefully you all have science and digestion. There's a lot of science in a few minutes. I'm gonna now turn to what we're actually doing on campus and how this is translating to on-the-ground actions. So over the past 7 years, we've been working to apply these guidelines to create habitat on campus across scales. And we've implemented these across literally dozens of projects, from these small scale courtyards and pollinator gardens, green roofs, to greenways, to these large scale multi-acre projects like the Charleston Retention Basin. Next slide. And so our goal in all of this work is essentially to create high quality habitat at scale that's ecologically connected and also accessible for people. And so this is vision that's derived from the frameworks that I just presented. And I think the thing to stress here is that, we're not just thinking about the number of trees or the number of acres of habitat, although we are also thinking about those things, and those are also quite important. But we're really thinking about how our efforts scale up cumulatively to support the things we care about around biodiversity and other multi-benefit performance goals. Next slide. So we're currently in the process of using that framework and the science guidelines that I've presented to develop a suite of both metrics and targets for each of those 4 dimensions. And we're doing that across all the scales that Google operates, from the parcel right up to the district level. And so at the parcel scale, we have developed a suite of quantitative targets for project teams that they can integrate into their designs to help achieve those 4 goals. So for example, around like % green space, species diversity, habitat structure. And then we've also used those targets to set contractual requirements around ecology performance expectations for each of our Silicon Valley development projects, again, at that parcel scale, project scale. Next slide. And currently, much of our focus is then up at the district scale. So thinking about translating some of our project scale expectations to district scale metrics and targets. So we're currently in the process of developing a similar suite of these key kind of indicator metrics and quantitative targets that have meaning at this district multi-project scale, and that also roll up to those overall 4 goals. So for example, around green space amount or green space accessibility. And so next slide. To date, through this work, we've planted over 2,000 trees and have created about 13 acres of new site-appropriate habitat on campus, with a whole lot more that's currently planned in the pipeline. And we're also in the process of developing a dashboard that helps align us to those key metrics that I've just described. All right, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about where our program is headed. And I'm going to focus on 2 things. The first is biodiversity monitoring, and then the second is thinking about how we're starting to expand this work beyond Silicon Valley. All right, so first, biodiversity monitoring. So we're investing a lot of effort in these landscape improvements on campus, and as part of that, we really wanted to understand, well, what are the actual benefits to biodiversity of the improvements that we're implementing? Are we getting more bees? Are we getting more insects? And if so, what are the specific landscape dimensions or actions that seem to matter most? And this is obviously going to be really critical for us and others as we think about both quantifying the benefit of what we're doing, but also informing, of course, future efforts. And so to get at this, we conducted our first monitoring effort of Google Campus, led by H.D. Harvey back in 2016, 2017. So we monitored a couple dozen sites, mostly Google sites across Mountain View and Sunnyvale, essentially asking this question, whether wildlife respond to these increasing levels of landscaping improvements, and if so, what specific improvements seem to have the biggest boost for biodiversity. So I'm going to give you a little bit of what we found a few years ago, but I also want to flag that we'll be doing resurveys of this work, these same sites, and then a few others, actually starting next week. So super excited to see what we find this spring. Next slide. All right, so what we're finding from this initial survey work is that yes, there is more biodiversity at sites with higher quality habitat, and wildlife are responding to these increasing levels of habitat quality. So there's a bunch to explore here, but just to pull on one example of this work. This is an example for birds and dimensions at the site scale. So we looked at site, neighborhood, and landscape scale habitat characteristics, landscape characteristics. And so here you can see that there is this increase in the number of bird species found at a site with both site vegetation structure, that's shown in orange. So that's things like having both trees and understory on a site. And then also with the canopy cover on a site, that's shown in green here. So essentially what we're seeing is that it looks like for every 5% increase in the site canopy cover, there's about 2 new species of birds that are found on site. So this is pretty exciting because it suggests that even at these like relatively low levels of existing habitat quality, that incremental improvements in structure, habitat quality, canopy cover really do make a difference in site biodiversity. And we're not just seeing that there's more species, but actually different species. And so with high quality habitat, we go from these more kind of urban adapted species like crows and sparrows to some of these more urban sensitive species like warblers and bluebirds. So lots more to dive into there, but really exciting preliminary findings. All right, finally, I'm going to talk about how we're starting to apply this approach that we've now piloted in Silicon Valley in other regions. And so the idea here is to take some of the lessons that we've learned in our work on our Silicon Valley campus and ideally start developing a model that Google can apply in regions globally. So this year we've kicked off our first non-Silicon Valley pilot in New York. So going from the very suburban office parks of Mountain View to the densest city in the United States. And we're kind of looking at similar goals, looking for opportunities to restore site appropriate habitat with the goals of both boosting biodiversity and habitat availability, but also improving nature access and creating that kind of model for what it might look like for private companies to be designing for nature in these dense urban cores. And so we're applying those same science frameworks and the same overall approach to New York to identify some of these priority opportunities to improve habitat. Next slide. So for example, as part of this work, we've developed a planting palette and a set of plant guidelines for our New York teams. So this is work that's been directly inspired by the Silicon Valley habitat guidelines that Dan will talk about. And so this is just a glimpse of that shown for one specific focal habitat type, coastal oak pine forest, which was one of the emblematic habitat types of Manhattan formerly. And so essentially we're drawing on the historical ecology and then filtering that work through whether a species is appropriate in the urban landscapes, whether it'll thrive, whether it's suitable for future climate envelopes and any aesthetics or maintenance considerations we need to think about. So we're giving this kind of lookbook of some of these key species and what they look like in a Manhattan context today. So we're currently working really closely with the landscape architect teams on some of these projects to incorporate this palette into the street tree and green roof design, aiming for aligning the plantings with this habitat type on campus. All right, I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to go pretty quickly through these because I know we're short on time, and we can revisit this at the end, perhaps. But I wanted to elevate kind of 3 key lessons from our work, and I think these resonate from my talk. But then I think you'll see them kind of preview where Dan and Drew will be going as well. First, I think we're really seeing how key science and data are for effective urban ecology implementation. So both this marrying of the global urban ecology science, but also local expertise that there's truly no substitute for. So thinking about that synthesis, as well as, of course, the importance of monitoring to actually influence and prioritize our actions moving forward. I also wanted to flag the importance of collaboration and partnerships to elevate impact. And I think we're seeing that both within Google, for example, making sure that ecologists are brought into truly multidisciplinary project teams early on so that ecology can sit alongside the engineering, the hydrology, landscape architecture early in the process as visions are being developed. But then, of course, also more broadly thinking about these critical cross-sector collaborations we're seeing across the region. And then finally, I just want to stress this importance we're seeing of integrating across scales. And I think in our work, we've really found that the landscape perspective in particular is super critical to identifying what we're doing at the site scale, but then also to just understand how all these pieces fit together and how our work actually connects to what everyone else is doing in the region. Obviously, birds don't care about property boundaries in particular. And so we see success not just about what we're doing on campus or even within a district, but about how we're coordinating and integrating these efforts across the region, from planting trees or backyard gardens to the larger scale efforts like the South Bay Salt Ponds Restoration Project. So we can revisit some of these at greater length in the Q&A, but just some things to mull over as we move forward with these talks. And so with that, I will hand it over to Dan for a deep dive into our ecology design guidelines.
That was great. Thanks, Erin. So what I'm going to be talking about is a real natural extension of sort of what Aaron was introducing you to there, sort of how Google is applying all of this knowledge that we've been acquiring. And it really has been very innovative the way that Google, going back 6 years when they started redeveloping their campuses, really integrated ecologists into the design teams, supported research of what's going on, and really tried to bring science to the table along with all the great designers that are working on these projects. And we developed a lot of, a lot of knowledge and realized we needed to document that to make it readily available and useful to design teams. That occurred first within Google, but what I'm going to be talking about, next slide please, is the importance of sharing that knowledge with others. And that's where we took some of the massive amounts of information we began to collect and apply within Google and made that publicly available. So these public ecology guidance documents, there are 2 of them that I'm going to talk about. They're both based very much on sort of the ecological science and landscape design efforts that we'd been engaging with under the Google projects. And there are two primary documents I want to talk about. The first one is for what we call larger users. They're public and private landowners. It might be large public entities like Valley Water or Caltrans who have lots of land. They have substantial resources. It may be large private landowners like tech campuses or office complexes, again, with substantial acreages. And again, I emphasize they have more resources than a lot of other folks, which is why we prepared a second document for residential owners, landowners. So we recognize that ecology needs to be implemented at various scales, as Aaron pointed out. So we had both that larger users document, and we have one that's more tuned into folks who have fewer resources to invest in their landscape. Nonetheless, we want to integrate ecological implementation across all of those large and small scales. So thus we have these 2 documents. And then I'm also going to then talk about 3 separate projects in Mountain View and Sunnyvale with Google that have been implemented that demonstrate how we've applied these types of guidelines. Next slide. So these are the 2 documents. Integrating nature into the urban landscape is the large users document, and gardening for habitat is the small user document. There are links on the screen here, and we will also be sharing both these links to these full documents and to other links that we've accumulated that are relevant to ecological design in the urban environment after this through Canopy. So everybody who's participating in this will have access to these documents. And I would like to emphasize that these are fairly extensive documents. They're 50, 60 pages long. There's a lot of content. I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to provide you with all of an introduction to all of the information in them. This is going to be just a sampling, almost a teaser. Think of this as a teaser to introduce you to what some of the content is in these 2 documents. And I hope that afterwards you spend more time reading them yourselves, and also please share these with your colleagues, friends, anybody who may be applying these. The more we can spread this knowledge, the more ecological improvements we'll see in our local and regional environments. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about large users first. Next. Here's the table of contents, just to give you a sense of sort of what the buckets of information in there are. We introduce people to sort of the ecological approach to landscapes. We provide some suggested goals and priorities, which I'll touch on in just a minute. We then start to provide some of the nitty gritty of it, which are what are some of the design parameters when you're doing an ecological design of a landscape that you want to keep in mind. We provide recommendations on sort of the management of your landscape. In other words, how do you maintain it? How do you manage it? Because ecological landscapes, even in an urban setting, are managed and maintained differently than conventional landscapes, where you're basically mowing your lawns, cutting your hedges, applying pesticides, lots of things you don't want to do in a more ecologically performative landscape. We also have a section on bird safe design guidelines, which is an important element, particularly for buildings with lots of glass facades. And then we provide plant palettes, and I'll get into that in more detail later on. Next slide. So first of all, I'd like to say for this document, we had a lot of great input, of course, from Google's ecology team, from the CNPS, Committee for Green Foothills, Living Classrooms, Audubon Society, Sierra Club, and our host for this webinar, Canopy. So we got a lot of really good input that helped us to craft a document that I think addresses the interest and needs of a lot of users, and we really appreciate all of their input. Next. So goals and priorities. These are suggestions for people to think about their landscapes a little differently. So you're a large user, you're designing a campus or a large terrain, if you're Valley Water maybe. You want to think about the overarching goal that you're trying to achieve of a landscape that has habitat value and that contributes to the ecological health of at a regional scale. And then there are supporting objectives that help you to achieve that goal. I'll touch on just a couple of those. One, we want people to think about habitat areas that in these sort of settings as something that should persist and regenerate over time. So you're talking about installing woody plants that are long-lived, that are well suited to the environment. You want to be thinking about preparing your site so that they grow in a healthy fashion. So there's a lot of thought that has to go into a landscape that you want to persist over decades and decades and decades, as opposed to a conventional landscape where you plop in your lawn and your hedge, and you may go in and even replace that every 5 or 10 years. So it's a different way of thinking about it. I'm not going to go through all of these goals. We'll just move on. Yeah, that's okay. That's fine, Drew. Next one is fine. This is so getting into some of the planting configurations that we introduce people to. And again, these are suggestions to get people to think about their landscape. What this cross section shows is thinking about in your urban setting, you want to have both some areas that are a little bit more devoted to nature. You also obviously have your human use areas. So towards the right, you see there's a plaza. Next to that, you might want to have a large tree that provides some shading. As you move to the left, there's a core area where you maybe have a little more space for a more ecologically performative portion of your landscape. That may be a little bit denser. It may be a little bit richer. It may not be quite as tidy and manicured as areas closer to people. So you may be getting a lot of your sort of natural benefits in those sort of core areas that you can have, even in an urban setting. And then you're getting over towards pedestrian pathways, bikeways, roads. Again, you're getting down to a different type of planting. You might be having pollinator strips along those walkways, things like that. So we want people to think about the different ways that people and nature can be combined in the urban context. Next. So this is one page out of the plant palette, and the plant palette is, I don't know, probably 10, 11 or 12 pages long. A lot of work went into this. This is probably one of the real go-to parts of our publicly available documents, which people go to over and over again because there's so much information here. So we've got a lot of native species that are listed. We provide their sun and shade tolerance, some information about their color and seasonality, because in these urban environments, we want to be thinking not just about nature performance, but also about sort of the aesthetics. Canopy size, like what's going to fit where on your site, salt tolerance in case you're using recycled water. WCALS is the water usage rating for each species. And then we have a number of different columns that address what habitat type these species belong in, because it's good to think about the plant associations that occur out in nature that you want to replicate to some degree for a couple of reasons. One, wildlife will be more attracted to plant associations that mimic what they find in the natural habitats and that they've evolved with. Secondly, most people, particularly like in the Bay Area where you have access to a lot of open space, have a bit of an eye for what looks like a natural association of plants they would expect to see together in nature. So trying to get a sense of which species belong in which habitats helps you sort of cluster those on your site. And then we have some other categories here giving information about whether or not a species is associated with high bird use, maybe butterflies, beneficial insects, and an observation column with just a collection of a variety of different information that we think might be useful on each species. So a real good go-to page in the document. Next. And we provide some representative photos so people get a little bit of an idea of what some of these species look like. Next. And finally, in the appendix, we have a checklist. This is just one page out of the checklist. There's also a checklist associated with bird safe design, but the intent of this is it can be for a couple of audiences. One, for the person who's designing a landscape to go. It's a one location where they can go that kind of reminds them as they work through their design of what their goals and priorities were. And it's kind of, okay, did I really keep these in mind as I work through all the challenges and compromises and develop my design. Have I really kept my goals and priorities in mind? And then we actually have the literal checklist of design parameters and management parameters, just so people can kind of grade themselves and say, how well did I do on this? Did I really remember to incorporate native oaks in a fashion that addresses reoaking, for example? The other way this could be used, so the other audience for a checklist like this are folks who are reviewing somebody else's design. And you could use this as a checklist to determine to what extent they've sort of kept in mind some of the ecological design parameters that this document suggests are worth considering. Next slide. So now we're moving on to our small users. So this is primarily residential landowners, maybe small businesses, which could, at scale, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of those potential users. So it's a way to hopefully achieve some synergies at scale by providing this kind of information to many, many, many small users. Next slide. And in this, we give people sort of a little bit of an introduction to regional context. So you're a residential homeowner, for example, you may not think that often about how your home fits into the regional context. So we want to provide people with sort of an introduction to how to think differently about their place in the environment. We provide some very sort of grassroots recommendations for how to analyze your site, how to design your planting. We provide some sample layouts and so on and so forth. Next slide. So here's an example of how we sort of help people to think a little bit about their place in the environment. There's information about historical conditions, which many people won't think about that often. This is derived from materials that have been produced by the San Francisco Estuary Institute. They've done a lot of work in Silicon Valley and other areas on what historically occurred in these areas. And it's a useful backdrop, often to thinking about your site. It's nice when conditions are still suitable for restoring some of the historical habitats, because wildlife will generally respond well to that. It's not always possible because sometimes conditions, soil conditions, hydrology conditions, have been altered so substantially. So that's, nonetheless, it allows people to think a little bit more regionally and also temporally a little differently about their place in the environment. Next slide. Site analysis, we give some just very, like I said, sort of grassroots recommendations for how to look at your site in terms of what is the existing vegetation. That can tell you something about what might do well in terms of new plantings. Looking at your soils and drainage, sun and shade distribution, all of sort of the basics that people should be thinking about. Next. Invasive plants. So our bugaboo. Obviously, a lot of our urban areas are rife with invasive plants. They are also readily available in many of our nurseries. And we're sort of trying to turn that tide and try to rebalance things back towards a greater native complement of species, which is what the bulk of our document talks about. But we really want to alert people to some of the resources for identifying native invasive plants, which ones, we have a list here of which ones are most commonly found in nurseries that they should really avoid. And we provide recommendations in various parts of the document for removing invasive plants from your property. Next slide. One of the ways that small landowners can encourage native habitats to establish on a property without a lot of resources is to simply encourage the native recruits that may pop up on your property. In much of the South Bay and the Bay Area, scrub jays and other birds place acorns all over properties. And so if you would like some oaks in your yard, oftentimes you just need to keep your eye out and identify the right oak tree in the right place. If it's about in the location you want it to be, protect it and you have a free tree. It also means that if it's planted there, naturally, if it's recruiting naturally, it probably belongs in that area. It probably is suited to the soils and hydrology of that area. So it's an easy way for people to get free trees, basically. Next slide. We provide some, most people who, landowners aren't like, unlike the large users who can have a consultant and a soils lab analyze their soils, most people aren't going to want to invest in that. We provide some very basic guidance for analyzing soils yourself, because obviously The nature of your soils does to some degree dictate the type of plant species that will grow well at your location. Next slide. Again, we have a variety of different sort of ready-made suggested plant palettes for people, depending on how sunny or shady or wet or dry their location is. So just some ready-made plant mixes that people can pull from. Next. And similarly, we provided and this is the one for the front and the backyard, a template, sort of a sample plant layout to suggest to people how you might arrange plants and species to create a nice functional habitat that is aesthetically desirable. So we have a sheet in the document on front and backyards. We have one on sidewalks. We have one on screening the side of your property, just to sort of jumpstart people in thinking about how to lay out their plantings. Next page, next slide. So now I'm going to move into 3 projects that have been implemented at Google. This first one is called the Green Loop. It's in Mountain View. It's a greenway that cuts through mid-block through several different blocks of existing campus areas. This was designed and installed very quickly back in about 2015. Next slide. Oop, go back one. There we are. Yeah, so it's a mid-block connection through these different campus areas to create much more enjoyable and safer connectivity for bicyclists and pedestrians, and also connectivity for ecologies, because to the west is Permanente Creek, to the east is Stevens Creek, and over time, in addition to the Green Loop, there have been several other Google projects, one of which I'll touch on in just a minute, which are additively creating a greenway connection between those 2 creeks. So it's an ecological connection as well. On this Green Loop, there are about 1.4 acres of native landscape that were installed. A lot of native trees were placed, including 84 native oaks. And the design was very much focused on really creating a very sort of aesthetically pleasing and biophilic experience for people. So lots of flowers, lots of color, lots of attraction of hummingbirds and butterflies. And it's been very successful. It's a very enjoyable place for people to be. And a similar facility, an even longer greenway that's a bike ped facility, is being currently designed by Google in Sunnyvale, and will be implemented sometime in the next couple of years. Next slide. So this is 1212 Bordeaux. It's the Google's first ground up building. It's in Sunnyvale in the Moffett Park area. It's a very innovative building with lots of energy saving and environmental design features to it. And it also is close to the Sunnyvale West Channel. You can see that in the graphic on the left. Which is a flood control channel. Nonetheless, it has perennial water. So in the landscape, we tried to hearken a little bit to that adjacency to a waterway. Next slide. About 1.3 acres of native landscape was installed, which is about 25% of the project site, which is quite a good achievement. A lot of trees were placed on this site, including native oaks. And in the circular photo, sort of at the bottom of this slide, you can see to the left a little bit, you can see some big olive trees. Those were existing trees that were intentionally left in place along the street at this site because of their sort of impressive appearance, and they also provide good structure just for habitat. But we complemented them, and to the right of the walkway, what you see we complemented them with some really high performing native plantings, and those are willows. So again, sort of touching back to the fact that this is along a creek. Next slide. The next project that's been implemented is the Charleston Retention Basin. This is back in Mountain View again. This is a city flood control basin that was scooped out decades ago. It was basically a big bare soil pit to retain storm flow from the urban areas. Over time, it naturally recruited to a beautiful riparian marsh, and it's now a real birding hotspot in the South Bay. It's got a lot of willow groves in it, which are a historically important component of habitat in this area. And this project involved Google actually giving up quite a bit of their land in terms of parking stalls to expand this existing habitat. So substantial habitat improvements. There were substantial new circulation improvements in terms of 2 new pedestrian bridges across the narrow parts of the basin and new bike and pedestrian pathways, all the while maintaining complete functionality of the stormwater retention. So this is a real close partnership between the city and Google. Next slide. This is so about almost 6 acres of new native vegetation was put in, the majority of which is riparian, transitioning into oak perimeter on the upper parts of the site. 1,800 native trees were installed. As I mentioned, there were parking stalls removed, 134 parking stalls removed, which is a substantial contribution. And we also placed interpretive signage at this site. And what you see in this rendering is a little overlook that we placed into the side of the basin, sort of very artfully done so that it's a pleasing area to be. It provides good nature viewing without being too intrusive and disturbing wildlife. Next slide. Here's some construction photos. On the left, you see a wooden boardwalk that was placed through a grove of cottonwoods on the edge of the basin to avoid disturbing their roots. And in the middle, you see the overlook being constructed, some of the plants from the nursery, and one of the walkways on the right side there. Next slide. With that, I will turn it over to Drew. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dan. I will try to bring us home by 11 or a couple minutes afterwards. I'm Drew Wenzel. I am a development executive with Google, and thanks again to Canopy for inviting us to participate in this speaker series. Dan and Aaron just went through all the great science behind these guidelines, and I've had the great job of finding ways to implement those guidelines on some of our ground-up construction projects. So in this section, I'll go through 2 of those main examples, both in Mountain View. And to start us off, I saw that we had several people who were calling in not from the Bay Area, so I thought I would take a moment to orient us. Mountain View here in the kind of lower half of the Bay Area is located between Palo Alto and Sunnyvale, kind of on the lower peninsula. And then our projects are in this kind of subsection of Mountain View called North Bayshore, which is bounded kind of on the south by 101, by Stevens Creek on the east side, the Bay up on the north side, and then San Antonio Road on the west. And I mean, this region was originally developed kind of in the about 50 or so years ago, at a time when car was king, and we had a lot of kind of adjacencies still today to like NASA and Lockheed Martin and other parts of Silicon Valley, and this became a big technical and commercial hub for the city of Mountain View, much like we see in many parts around the Bay Area today. But that kind of low density development kind of what resulted in this kind of legacy of low-rise buildings surrounded by a lot of parking that we are now looking to find ways to reinvent. I think that a lot of our legacy buildings have parking ratios of about 4 spaces per 1,000. The city has lowered that to a 2.7 maximum at this point, and we're trying to build our new projects at 2 spaces per 1,000. Now it's worth noting that even with this kind of urbanization of this part of the city that's right next to the Bay Area, I mean, the city of Mountain View over the years has done a fantastic job of balancing kind of the commercial and kind of economic aspects that have driven this part of the city with the habitat and ecology that has historically been here. I mean, anybody who's been to Shoreline Regional Park or used the Bay Trails can really attest to that. But as Aaron and Dan were talking about, our hope now is to find ways to bring that into kind of the redevelopment that we see and have before us, and not have it be something that is just done over here and sort of kept separate. So to that end, we're going to talk about 2 main projects today, Charleston East and Landings. Charleston East over on the kind of upper right side of the screen here is about 595,000 square feet, and it's on a roughly 18-acre site. The project was approved by the city in 2016, and it's currently under construction. However, it's worth noting, as Dan was mentioning before, that even before we started this project, we looked very carefully at kind of the whole of the district and what this project was going to be kind of fitting into in terms of its context. And when we applied an ecological lens to that, I mean, this is really what we saw, is all these incredible adjacencies that Dan was just talking about to either existing or new kind of ecological habitat that we were had the opportunity to connect with. So we've got Stevens Creek Trail and Stevens Creek itself over on the west side of the screen here, or the east side of the screen, the retention basin, and Dan just walking through kind of the expansion efforts that we supported there. And so the opportunity became to use Charleston East as a way to continue that kind of contiguous, meaningful ecological habitat across the site here. And so that was done in a couple of ways. First off, just how we placed the building itself, instead of having it kind of square up with the frontages of the street, by rotating it counterclockwise about 20 degrees or so, we were able to create this more meaningful area down in the kind of southeast corner of the site, this plaza here, that made it easier for us to create this transition across from the retention basin and down across the southern part of the site here. The second piece of this was, actually, what do we put in that plaza area itself? And well, across the site, we had the opportunity to replace a bunch of non-native trees with a really kind of great palette, a diverse palette of native species. And so we have 3 different kinds of oaks. We have cottonwoods. We've got willows where we have the high groundwater to be able to support them. And so following guidance like in the re-oaking document around where we place these trees and how far apart they were spaced, so that we could really kind of meaningfully create that connected canopy and habitat across the bottom part of the site here. And kind of you can see that a little bit better at this more zoomed in level here, where we how we planted these, what we called landscape islands, working with our landscape architect. And so that becomes more of a continuous connected canopy across the southeast plaza there. The other really kind of meaningful move that I think we were able to work with the city on was the street frontages themselves. And so the city's looking to, redevelop the frontages of these streets so that you don't have just, good facilities for cars, but you have buffers for people to bike and walk and plant trees in those buffers so that it all looks and feels like a really good experience. Usually cities like to have single species in these front strips because it's easier to maintain and it has a nice uniform look. But that can introduce some problems with, if that single species gets a disease, they could all die at the same time. But even if not, if they're planted at the same time, they'll probably reach the end of life at the same time. And you end up with the same situation. So we had a really great kind of conversation with the city arborist where we proposed a mix of a couple different tree species along these frontages to help mitigate for those potential problems, but also keep the city's maintenance concerns in mind as well. And the arborist was supportive of moving forward with a mix. Here you can see we've got Fremont cottonwoods and sycamores in these frontages on the south side of the site. Around some of the other frontages, we have a couple of the other oak species as well. But it was a really good win. And it just goes to show, if you're armed with the right information and you ask for things, you might actually be able to have some wins that you wouldn't have if you didn't ask. So the other co-benefits here, as Dan was talking about a second ago, are the water, keeping track of our time, the water benefits of these species. Just really, having the ability to use these native species will mean that they are not going to be relying on supplemental irrigation for the long term. I'll go a little faster here. We have some renderings of what this may look like at maturity, what those frontages and the tree species may look like in 10 or so years once the project is complete. Kind of standing on this landscape island, looking back across the plaza. And with that, we'll move on down the road to landings. Just kind of some contrast again for today. You know, it's a bunch of disconnected buildings surrounded by a lot of parking. We have parking on the design site, but it is all underneath the project itself. The landings project is, you know, Dan and Aaron were saying, like we really were able to learn from Charleston East and the wins we had there. Also, how we brought our teams on, as Dan was saying, was really important. You know, before you even start designing the building, you start looking at the massing of the project and how, you know, what are the macro constraints on the site. You have your traditional ones, your setbacks from the city, your height constraints. But bringing on the first teams, we had an architect, we had an urban planner, we had a daylight consultant, and we had our ecologists. And so they were able to kind of put the kind of big moves, opportunities and constraints from each of those lenses before we even really started designing the building. So we had the opportunity to look at the creek, which is a new constraint and opportunity over on the east side of the campus here, to say, what could we do here before we start boxing ourselves in and get really started on the right foot. Another kind of tree specific win here, I think, that is worth mentioning. The city has a 2-to-1 tree replacement requirement for heritage trees and a 1-to-1 replacement for non-heritage trees. We fit as many as we could on site and as many as they made sense to do, but we didn't fit all of those 1-to-1 replacements. So we worked with the city to find opportunities in their land that they owned around North Bayshore to replace trees that needed reaching the end of their life or were not doing well for other reasons. And these 4 sites are all moving forward at this point. And so at some point, you know, these trees will be in place and growing before we even begin on the landings project itself. So less tree specific, but a really great ecological win for this site is what is designed for Permanente Creek. Today, this creek is a really channelized stream that is very good at its, you know, flood control, you know, purposes and protecting the property and people around it, but it doesn't have a whole lot of habitat and ecological value to it. So our proposed design was, you know, using the redevelopment of our site, how do we kind of blend that west side of the creek into our landscaping, you know, expand that aquatic and riparian habitat there, still maintain all of those flood needs that Valley Water has, but hopefully really turn this into a great ecological and other amenities for the people who are going to be at this location. So this is kind of our idealized cross section of the creek. Dan went through something like this a little earlier, so I won't spend time on it. But we had a lot of design constraints to balance here. We wanted to get as much habitat into this, but it was a very iterative process with our hydraulic engineers and managing the needs that the oversight agencies, the Army Corps, CDFW have for this region. So it took a long time to kind of make sure that we had the right balance of flood control and creating habitat and creating a good site amenity that everyone would enjoy. But through that kind of continuous process, we were able to get as many trees as we could there while still maintaining the needs and the other requirements that were placed on this creek. And so you can kind of just sort of see each step of that. Up top is what exists today, this channelized section of Permanente Creek. The middle section, kind of this redesigned, more from the civil and hydraulic perspective. What are the moves that we needed to make to ensure that, you know, this would still function as it needed to? And then that part of the rendering of what it might look like in the future when it's built out. A little bit more on the trees. Again, using the same sort of planting guidelines Dan and Aaron walked through. You can really kind of see, though, in this case, how we are transitioning from, you know, our willows and cottonwoods down near the water in the riparian corridor to our oak savanna as we get to higher ground. And I'll kind of end on the partnerships theme that Aaron was talking about earlier. Valley Water is a great partner. They have to make sure that they're adhering to all of the regulatory oversight that the Army Corps and CDFW and other agencies have in terms of maintaining habitat and ecology in these creek sections. So it's a great project, but we needed to make sure that there was kind of extra incentive for them to allow us to do this project. So in working with them and the oversight agencies, all of these hatched areas are the required mitigation for our project. I mean, whatever you disturb, you have to put back in a reasonable or equal manner. The unhatched areas, all this green space here and here, and the blue space down here, is new riparian and aquatic habitat that was created as a result of this project, and area that totals to about 1.5 acres that we were able to give to Valley Water so that they could use that for their future projects or their operational needs. So, this was really a win-win-win across the board. A great project for us and a site amenity. A great win for Valley Water in terms of them being able to bank some of this habitat if and when this goes forward, and a win for the ecology as well. This project is designed, and it may be moving forward. We're kind of working through if and when that's going to happen as we kind of ramp back up after a pause due to COVID. But again, this is an example of just how all of these guidelines and science are guiding our work. And this is what it might look like at the end of the day when it's all said and done. And with that, that brings me to the end of my slides, and I will hand things back to Aaron to wrap things up.
Thanks. I think I might hand it right back to Igor, right?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Aaron, Dan, and Drew. I think we are ready for the question and answer session, and I think, yeah, I'm not well. I'll put my screen back on just so you can see who our presenters were. But I will let our question wrangler Elise wrangle the questions. So Elise, over to you.
All righty. Thanks so much, everybody. That was really great. We're definitely not going to get through every single question during this session, but I think we can do a pretty good job getting through a number of them. And then anything that we don't get to before the end of our time today, we'll do our best to answer after the webinar and send that out in the email, along with links to many, many, many resources. So, first of all, so one question is kind of related to climate change. So we know that climate change is something that we're all thinking about, and we don't necessarily know how native species are going to adapt and thrive. And so we're wondering how you all make decisions about what to plant based on this type of scenario with warmer, drier conditions in the future.
Sure, thanks. And maybe I can start, and then Dan, Drew, you guys can chime in. It's definitely top of mind for us as well, of course, as we're thinking about how we can make sure we understand what we're planting now will thrive in the future, and how we think about where we're heading in the next 5, 10, 20 years. I think we're trying to thread the same needle that many of us are around making sure that we're drawing on native site appropriate species to maximize biodiversity and ecosystem function for native wildlife, but also that the plants we choose are gonna thrive and actually provide those benefits in the long run. And so I think we're actively kind of assessing climate risk. I think particularly, as you note, around heat and water stress. And I think we're finding that the approach is going to depend a little bit on the species. For some of the short-lived species, flowering plants or herbaceous cover, those are places where it isn't necessarily critical that what we're doing now is going to survive for a long period of time, since we can adjust as we need to. So I think that's kind of an easier lift. And I think it's obviously less trivial as we think about tree canopy. I think we're lucky that a lot of the kind of cornerstone trees that we would be thinking about planting in this area are projected to be suitable in the area for quite a long time. And a lot of them are either tapping into groundwater for riparian species or climate resilient already. But we're also thinking about what those other options are to make sure that we can essentially like hedge our bets with and create more resilient landscapes through diversity, and thinking particularly around drawing, exploring options to draw from adjacent areas, whether those are, a little bit south or a little bit up or down slope, or thinking about even whether there are other kind of better adapted genotypes or phenotypes for different trees that we could draw on from adjacent areas. So this is all very live for us, but that's kind of some of our current thinking about how we approach it. Dan, do you have more to add?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. That was a really good overview. A couple of things I might add to that is that one of the ways in planting these new, more native landscapes that we can help address climate resilience is by really ensuring that there are truly healthy growing conditions for the plants. All too often, I think in the urban settings, like plants are just plopped into a hole in the ground, and whoever's responsible for them just kind of walks away. That's really not Google's approach. Google has been looking really carefully at groundwater, at soils, investing a lot on a lot of these projects. There have been very, very substantial investments in healthy soils. Healthy soils is where you start your healthy trees from. And if you don't have healthy soils, then over time, you're going to have less healthy vegetation that is not going to be as resilient to changes in climate. So that's a big part of it. I think the way that the sites are managed also, again, it's a little bit soil centric, but the way you manage your site addresses how healthy your soil is. Do you allow your leaf litter and your small branches to naturally accumulate and create a healthy mulch layer that's going to make that plant more resilient in times of drought or high heat? That could be key. And all of the soil microorganisms contribute to vegetation health as well. So healthy soils go hand in hand with healthy species. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Do you all have a method for monitoring your projects in terms of, it can go as far as soil health and irrigation and all those things, and kind of, what does your on the ground monitoring and maintenance kind of look like for your typical project?
Well, I will say that we have a really great landscape operations team, and they have found ways to not just maintain the conventional landscapes that we have in some of our leased or older buildings, but have worked really closely with Dan and Erin and our other kind of science partners to make sure that when we do something like a habitat garden, a pollinator garden, like they know what they need to do to make sure that they maintain that differently and better than or than the traditional ones. And it's a learning process, but I think it's been going well.
So it sounds like it's you have maybe a contractor that you train, that you use your expert ecologists and so forth to train so that they don't prune a native tree or shrub or something in a inappropriate manner or something like that. That's part of the process.
Correct.
Okay. Does that take a lot of time? I'm just curious.
I think I'll need to defer to Erin on how much time and effort that is.
That's really kind of a Dan question, probably, or if Andrew Rivlin question.
Yeah, I could jump in on that. It actually, sometimes it takes quite a bit of effort. For example, at the Charleston Retention Basin, we actually have a team of ecologists working hand in hand, routinely monitoring very intensively all of that planting because it's in a very natural habitat, because there's some permits associated with it, and because, again, we really want it to be very successful in terms of complementing the existing habitat there. So that's an example of really intensive effort where you have ecologists at the site 8 or 10 times a year for a full day, writing technical memos, really recording how the vegetation is growing, if any invasives are coming in. The other end of the spectrum is sort of our more routine effort. As Drew pointed out, we have landscape crews that are already pretty tuned into native landscapes. They confer with us when they have a question about something ecological, or we also visit the sites once or twice a year and we'll just engage with them to in terms of what we've sort of observed anecdotally. And so that's a lighter touch, but it seems to work actually quite well.
That's great. Yeah, there were several questions kind of relating to monitoring and maintenance and things like that. So another question we had was about how far you all plan out for the lifespan of your campus, which can include like the buildings, with the survivability of the species that you're choosing. Kind of you talked about scale in terms of, you know, the sizes of the sites quite a bit, but we're curious too about the time frame and how long you're planning.
You know, I've been in a number of conversations where building interiors or furniture will turn over every 3 to 5 years or so, but the new buildings that we're constructing are intended to be 50 to 100-year buildings. And so if the structure of those buildings is not changing, the general kind of landscaping around them shouldn't really be changing either. And so I would say that, you know, when we're looking at these new projects and the landscaping associated with them, that it's at least that sort of time frame.
Gotcha. And maybe this is another good one for you, Drew. There's a question about how your projects consider the future of transportation, like freeways, expressways, roadways, sidewalks, basically just transportation in general. How do you all address that? And we know, you know, street trees were also a question. There's probably going to be a few specific ones for you all to answer later about like street tree selection and things like that.
Yeah, you know, the Green Loop in Mountain View and the Green Link, as it will be soon built out, or parts of it will start getting built out in Sunnyvale. I think that cross section that Dan had, kind of from like the building through a site landscape to a sidewalk and bike lanes out to a street, like that's the sort of environment that I think we in cities want to create. We want to have, you know, we have to be able to support, you know, the vehicles that we still need, but we need to have kind of separate and good experiences for bicyclists and pedestrians as well. And that doesn't mean shoving pedestrians into a 3-foot sidewalk right next to the cars. I mean, that is a thoughtful kind of laying out of street, trees, bikes, trees, sidewalk, landscaping. And then from there, I think it is thoughtfully, what do you put in those landscaping areas? So I would say that's generally the where you have all those components, what it would look something like that. You know, the Green Loop and the Green Link in many places will be completely separated from vehicular travel as well, which creates a lot more opportunities for enhanced planting opportunities and just a better experience for the people who are using those facilities too. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but it's every environment's just a little bit different, but it is finding ways to make sure those elements are incorporated in whatever way you can and make sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Drew. Another concern, I mentioned climate change earlier. Part of that that was asked about specifically is sea level rise. And I know specifically for the main Google campus in Mountain View, is there, you know, are there considerations around that as well?
I'll start with the building side of things. Every project, we need to make sure that we're looking very carefully at, flooding and planning for things like sea level rise. I believe all of our new buildings have first floor elevations that are at least 18 feet, I think it is. And so that's protecting the majority of the building and from a future sea level rise condition, and more likely a sea level rise plus a storm event or flooding. The groundwater side of things, I think I'll ask Aaron and Dan to jump in. I just think it's we see it coming, and it's a matter of thoughtfully trying to work with the topography we have or whatever changes we can make there to plant the species that make the most sense for now and going forward. But Aaron and Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd really add much more than that, because I think we're already looking closely at what groundwater is currently, and if we're in any locations where we're anywhere close, 5 to 10 feet within groundwater, we're selecting species that are reasonably tolerant of fairly moist soil conditions. So, I mean, I think the current plantings would be able to tolerate some level of increases in groundwater already, just based on species selection.
All right. Well, thank you for answering that. I'm curious. So I've read a number of the documents, probably all of the ones that you all referenced today. In particular, I was looking at the H.T. Harvey guidelines just today. And so not in preparation for this, for a totally different thing. They're really, really useful. I want to encourage everyone to check them out when we send you the links. They're available online. For those who haven't read some of these guiding documents, the H.T. Harvey, those specific lists of trees and plants, the SFEI documents that are really great. Is there anything that you would want to share, just even off the top of your head, or like a big takeaway that you think would be useful for folks tuning in today? I'd love to hear from each of you on that one.
Dan, will you start us off here, and then I'll jump in after you.
Sure. And I'm going to tear off one of the comments that I saw from Edward, who indicated that in the East Bay, quote, "We run into constant pushback from cities on use of native trees. How is Google able to get past this?" So I would even broaden out that issue in terms of it's something that we encounter in many different ways, and trying to incorporate these more native landscapes into not only street trees that cities have to approve, but into campuses where the landscape looks different to people. And they have to get used to a little bit different aesthetic, and we have to design something that's supposed to be ecologically performative, but also aesthetically pleasing to people. I think all of us, and hopefully everybody who's chosen to join this call, is looking at this as it's a long-term effort for us to sort of convert the thinking not only of designers, but the public who's engaging with these landscapes. And so these sort of knowledge-based documents we're sharing with everybody is hopefully putting some of the tools in people's hands to start to learn how to design these landscapes and implement them. There's some information you can use to maybe convince people that native plants do belong and can grow well in these settings. But we've got a little bit of a long haul, because until people actually see it done, they may not always believe it. But bit by bit, we're going to chip away at that. So this is a process of incremental success that I look at, of bit by bit converting more of these urban landscapes to more native performative landscapes, so people understand them, appreciate them, and then nurture them in the future. So hopefully that's kind of where we're able to sort of help the whole process, is by putting tools in people's hands.
I'll just second all that. I think that these first projects are going to run into a little bit more difficulty because they're doing things differently. But I mean, we're already, as Aaron was talking, we're already seeing the biodiversity benefits come from some of these efforts, and I think we'll just continue to see all of these co-benefits as we go forward, and the conversation will get easier.
And I'll add to your question, Elise. I'll put in a plug for the new, very geeky but very fun paper on how cities contribute to regional biodiversity. I'm really excited about that as an addition to our thinking as we think. I think we've had our hands full just thinking about how we coordinate and integrate at the city scale. But there's this additional opportunity to really think about how species move across a landscape mosaic with cities as one part of that fabric. And I think we're finding that really useful to be thinking about okay, well, which species are using urban areas and how can we actually design for that? So if you want a deep dive on the landscape ecology, I'd recommend that as well.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, we only have a couple more minutes here before we probably need to do the final words from Igor. I would like to ask a question that wasn't asked. It's my own personal one. What is a tree, because this is Canopy, what is a tree that you have been seeing really thriving in your project lately?
Well, I think the project that's furthest along in kind of its establishment is probably the retention basin, and so I would imagine it's all the willows that we have over there because of the high groundwater.
Yeah, I think the willows have exploded at the basin, and then on the green loop, actually, I think we had some surprises with some of the oaks and alders. The soils weren't great there. We had to invest in bringing in and amending some soils. We planted a lot of valley oak and coast live oak. And interestingly, right next to one of the sort of very brightly faced buildings, there was some valley oaks put in that grew stupendously. They were put in as 24-inch boxes. They were about 8 feet tall. They grew about 8 to 10 feet almost every year for the first 3 or 4 years. They're about 35 feet tall now. And this is just speculation, but it might have been all the nutrients in the recycled water, and also the fact that it was a very reflective building. And so it got like 5 times as much solar radiation as plants often get. So, but I think just in general, we've been really, really pleased with how oaks have performed in these urban landscapes. They're a really resilient, robust species. And to Edward's comment about cities kind of not wanting native trees, getting them to accept oaks on their streets has been a little bit of a struggle, and we've been sometimes successful and sometimes not so successful at convincing various cities to accept them. You just have to keep up the good fight.
Mm-hmm. Erin, how about you?
I don't think I have anything else to add. Those are great. I was also thinking about the willows, so seems like a good place to end.
Awesome. Well, good. Just wanted to check.
I would just add one more, and it's kind of my favorite species, which is the Fremont cottonwood, which is when you do have the water, either high groundwater or a surplus of recycled water or whatever. The Fremont cottonwood is a really stupendous tree in these urban environments for a couple of reasons. It's very attractive to birds, and we get extremely high bird use seasonally in Fremont cottonwood. It grows faster than almost any other species to a very large tree with a very dramatic, large canopy that provides wonderful shade in hot summer, and in the fall, beautiful fall colors. So shout out to Fremont cottonwood, which has performed really well on the campuses too.
Love that. Awesome. Well, thank you very, very much for answering our questions. There's more to come. So with that, I'd like to pass it back to Igor for final words.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So please go ahead and sign up for the next webinar, Greening the Outdoor Classroom, Bringing Nature to School Campuses, on Thursday, May 20th. And don't forget, there will be a survey coming to you shortly. So if you check the chat box, you will see the survey link. So go ahead, click on the chat. It's right there in the chat. And click on that survey link so you can fill out the survey and you can get your CEUs if you are an ISA certified arborist. And I think that is all. I just want to remind everybody that there's a job opportunity, the Tree Program Senior Manager at Canopy. So if you're interested, or if you know somebody who might be interested, please check the details on Canopy's webpage. And I think with that, we are just about out of time. I want to thank our panelists again, Erin, Dan, and Drew, and of course, our hosts, Canopy, Elise, Natalie, and everybody at Canopy. And I think that is it. So thank you all and have a nice rest of your week. And again, survey, survey, survey. Don't forget the survey. So thank you all. That's it for me.